The conference room felt suffocating as my manager, Derek, slid the document across the mahogany table. 20% pay cut, Veda. Accept it or clean out your desk. 5 years of building relationships, securing our company's most valuable vendor partnership, and this was my reward. The irony wasn't lost on me. The vendor agreement I'd negotiated was worth $4.3 million annually. By the next morning, that same partnership would vanish, and Derek would learn the true cost of his power trip. Before we dive into this story of corporate karma, if you enjoy content about workplace justice and standing up for what's right, consider subscribing to join our growing community. We're working toward 5,000 subscribers who believe in accountability and fairness in professional settings. Your support helps us share more stories like this one. My name is Veda Rodriguez, and I served as Senior Account Director at Pinnacle Solutions, a mid-sized logistics company in Denver, Colorado. My grandmother raised me in a working-class neighborhood where she taught me that respect isn't given based on titles. It's earned through character and treating others with dignity. Those early lessons shaped how I approached business relationships, always remembering that behind every contract and negotiation were real people trying to make honest livings. The morning started like any other Tuesday in October. I arrived at Pinnacle Solutions at 7:30, grabbed my usual coffee from the break room, and settled into my corner office overlooking the Denver skyline. The autumn sun painted the mountains in brilliant oranges and purples, and I felt grateful for another day in a job I genuinely loved. My phone buzzed with a text from James Morrison, CEO of Apex Manufacturing, our largest vendor partner. Coffee later this week. Want to discuss expanding our partnership for next quarter? I smiled, typing back a quick confirmation. James and I had built a solid working relationship over the past 5 years, one founded on mutual respect and transparent communication. The relationship with Apex hadn't happened overnight. When I first joined Pinnacle, the company was struggling to maintain reliable vendor partnerships. Previous account managers had treated vendors as expendable, focusing solely on extracting the lowest possible prices without considering long-term relationship building. The turnover rate among our supplier base was astronomical. I took a different approach. Instead of viewing vendors as necessary evils, I saw them as strategic partners. I made site visits to their facilities, learned about their operational challenges, and worked collaboratively to create agreements that benefited both parties. With Apex Manufacturing specifically, I'd identified ways their production capabilities could expand beyond our traditional needs, opening doors for specialized services that commanded premium pricing. The partnership with Apex had grown from a modest $800,000 annual contract to our current $4.3 million agreement. More importantly, their reliability had improved our own customer satisfaction ratings significantly. When clients knew they could count on consistent, high-quality deliverables from our vendor network, they trusted Pinnacle with larger, more complex projects. Derek Williams had been promoted to Regional Operations Manager 6 months ago, inheriting oversight of my department among others. His background was primarily in cost reduction and operational efficiency skills that had value, but often came at the expense of relationship building and employee morale. From day one, he'd made it clear that he viewed vendor relationships through a purely transactional lens. Our first major disagreement had occurred during budget planning season. Derek wanted to renegotiate all vendor contracts with aggressive price reductions, regardless of performance or relationship history. I'd pushed back, explaining that strong vendor partnerships were strategic assets that shouldn't be jeopardized for short-term cost savings. "You're too emotionally invested in these relationships, Veda," he'd said during that meeting. "Business isn't about making friends, it's about maximizing profit margins." I tried to explain the financial benefits of vendor loyalty, reduced onboarding costs, consistent quality, preferential pricing on rush orders, and collaborative innovation opportunities. Derek had listened with barely concealed impatience, clearly viewing my approach as weakness rather than strategic thinking. The tension had been building for months. Derek instituted weekly vendor performance reviews that focused exclusively on cost metrics, ignoring quality indicators and relationship factors that I considered equally important. He'd begun scheduling meetings with my key vendors without including me, attempting to negotiate directly with contacts I'd spent years cultivating. The situation reached a breaking point 3 weeks before the October confrontation. Derek had called Apex Manufacturing directly, bypassing me entirely, to demand a 15% price reduction on their existing contract. James Morrison had called me immediately afterward, confused and concerned about the aggressive tactics. "Veda, I've never experienced anything like this," James had said during our phone conversation. Derek essentially threatened to terminate our partnership if we didn't accept the price cut immediately. No discussion of value, no consideration of our long-standing relationship. What's happening over there? I'd been mortified. Years of careful relationship building had been undermined in a single phone call. I'd apologized profusely to James and assured him that I would address the situation internally. But damage had been done. James mentioned that he'd already begun conversations with other logistics companies, just in case. When I confronted Derek about the unauthorized contact, his response had been dismissive. "I'm your manager, Veda. I don't need permission to communicate with vendors. If you can't handle the pressure of competitive negotiations, maybe this role isn't the right fit." The comment stung because it misrepresented everything I'd accomplished. Competitive negotiations were my specialty. I'd consistently secured favorable terms while maintaining positive relationships. Derek's approach wasn't competitive, it was destructive. I'd documented the incident in writing, copying human resources, and requested a meeting to discuss appropriate vendor communication protocols. Derek had responded by scheduling the meeting, but making it clear that he considered my concerns insubordination disguised as process improvement. The morning of our confrontation, I'd arrived early to prepare talking points about vendor relationship management and the long-term value of the partnerships I'd built. I'd pulled together performance data showing how vendor satisfaction correlated with our own customer retention rates, hoping to demonstrate the business case for collaborative rather than adversarial supplier relationships. Derek had other plans. Instead of discussing process improvements, he'd ambushed me with a restructuring announcement that would essentially eliminate my role while transferring my vendor relationships to his direct oversight. "The company is implementing cost reduction measures across all departments," he'd begun, sliding a folder across the conference table. "Your position is being restructured to focus on administrative support rather than strategic vendor management. The new compensation reflects these reduced responsibilities." I'd opened the folder to find a revised job description that stripped away everything I'd built over 5 years. Instead of senior account director, I'd become vendor relations coordinator, a glorified administrative assistant responsible for processing purchase orders and maintaining filing systems. The 20% pay reduction wasn't just about money, it was about systematically dismantling my professional standing. "This is unacceptable, Derek," I'd said, keeping my voice steady despite the anger building inside me. "You're essentially destroying vendor relationships that took years to build. Apex Manufacturing alone generates $4.3 million in annual revenue for this company. That partnership exists because of trust and mutual respect, not because of aggressive cost-cutting tactics." Derek had leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying the power dynamic. "Those relationships belong to Pinnacle Solutions, not to you personally. Any competent account manager should be able to maintain vendor partnerships by focusing on contract terms and deliverables. We don't need expensive relationship-building initiatives." His fundamental misunderstanding of business partnerships was staggering. Vendor relationships weren't just about contracts and deliverables, they were about trust, communication, problem-solving, and mutual growth. When challenges arose, strong relationships meant partners worked collaboratively to find solutions rather than pointing fingers and threatening legal action. "James Morrison has been considering other logistics partners specifically because of your communication approach," I'd responded. "If we lose Apex Manufacturing, it won't just be the revenue loss. Our production schedules will be disrupted, our other clients will be affected, and our reputation in the industry will suffer." Derek had waved dismissively. "Morrison is bluffing. Apex needs us more than we need them. If they want to find another logistics partner, they'll quickly discover that our pricing is competitive and our service standards are adequate. Empty threats don't concern me. The conversation had continued for another 20 minutes, with Derek outlining his vision for vendor management that prioritized cost reduction over everything else. He'd mentioned plans to consolidate our vendor base, eliminate redundant partnerships, and implement performance metrics focused exclusively on price competitiveness. I'd tried one final time to explain why his approach would backfire. Derek, vendor partnerships are strategic assets. When James Morrison calls me about production challenges or opportunities for innovation, that's not just customer service, it's business development. Those conversations have led to expanded contracts, improved processes, and cost savings that dwarf any short-term price reductions you might achieve through aggressive negotiations. His response had been the final straw. Veda, you're either part of the solution or part of the problem. Accept the restructured position with the adjusted compensation or clean out your desk. I don't have time for employees who can't adapt to changing business priorities. The ultimatum hung in the air between us. 20% pay cut, demotion to administrative duties, loss of strategic responsibilities, all to satisfy Derek's need to demonstrate authority and implement his cost reduction initiatives. I'd spent my entire career building relationships based on mutual respect and collaborative problem-solving. My grandmother had taught me that dignity wasn't negotiable, regardless of financial pressures or professional consequences. Derek was asking me to abandon everything I believed about ethical business practices and accept a role that would make me complicit in destroying partnerships I'd worked years to build. The decision crystallized in that moment. I'd reached the point where principles mattered more than paychecks, where professional integrity trumped job security. Standing up, I'd met Derek's gaze directly and delivered my response with calm determination. I won't be accepting your restructuring offer, Derek. Consider this my immediate resignation from Pinnacle Solutions. His reaction had been swift and revealing. Instead of professional disappointment or attempts at negotiation, Derek had smiled with obvious satisfaction. Finally, someone who understands consequences. Clean out your office by end of business today. Security will escort you out, and it will deactivate your access immediately. The security escort was unnecessarily dramatic, but Derek clearly wanted to send a message to other employees about challenging his authority. As I packed my personal belongings under the watchful eyes of a security guard, several colleagues stopped by to express shock and support. "This is insane, Veda," my cubicle neighbor Ashley had whispered. "Everyone knows you're the reason we have stable vendor relationships. Derek's making a huge mistake." Another colleague, Michael from the finance department, had been more direct. "James Morrison called looking for you this morning. When he finds out you're gone, Apex is going to reconsider their partnership. Derek has no idea what he's just done." By noon, I'd cleared out my office and returned my security badge and laptop. The escort to my car felt surreal. After 5 years of dedicated service, I was being treated like a potential security threat. But as I drove away from Pinnacle Solutions for the last time, I felt a sense of relief rather than regret. The first call had come at 2 o'clock that afternoon. James Morrison had tried reaching me at my office extension and been told I was no longer with the company. He'd tracked down my personal cell phone number and called immediately. "Veda, what the hell happened? Derek's assistant said you resigned, but that doesn't make sense. We have the quarterly review scheduled for next week, and you mentioned expanding our partnership scope." I'd explained the situation carefully, focusing on facts rather than emotions. Derek had restructured my position, eliminated my strategic responsibilities, and reduced my compensation by 20%. Rather than accept a role that would prevent me from maintaining the vendor relationships I'd built, I'd chosen to resign. James had been quiet for a long moment. "So Derek essentially forced you out because he doesn't value relationship-based vendor management." "That's an accurate summary," I'd confirmed. "His approach focuses exclusively on cost reduction and aggressive contract negotiations. He believes vendor partnerships can be maintained through pressure tactics rather than collaborative problem-solving." The implications had been immediate and obvious to James. Our partnership had thrived because of trust, communication, and mutual respect. When production challenges arose or opportunities for innovation emerged, James knew he could call me directly for collaborative problem-solving. Derek's approach would eliminate that strategic partnership model in favor of purely transactional vendor management. Veda, I need you to understand something, James had continued. Our partnership with Pinnacle wasn't just about logistics services. It was about having a strategic partner who understood our business goals and worked collaboratively to achieve them. You've been that partner for 5 years. Derek made it clear during our phone conversation last week that he doesn't value that approach. The conversation had lasted 45 minutes, covering everything from our history of successful collaborations to Derek's recent communication tactics. James had been particularly concerned about Derek's ultimatum regarding the 15% price reduction, viewing it as a fundamental misunderstanding of their partnership's value proposition. We've been considering expansion opportunities with Pinnacle because of our positive working relationship, James had explained. But Derek's approach suggests that future collaborations would be adversarial rather than strategic. That's not the kind of partnership Apex Manufacturing wants to pursue. By Thursday morning, James had made his decision. The call to Derek had been professional but definitive. Apex Manufacturing would be terminating their partnership with Pinnacle Solutions effective immediately. The $4.3 million annual contract would not be renewed, and they'd begin transitioning their logistics needs to alternative providers. Derek had called me within minutes of receiving James's cancellation notice, his previous arrogance replaced by panic. Veda, you need to fix this immediately. Morrison is being completely unreasonable, and I know you influenced his decision. I'd remained calm and professional during Derek's increasingly frantic phone call. James Morrison made his decision based on his assessment of Pinnacle's new vendor management approach. I didn't influence anything beyond explaining why I chose to resign rather than accept your restructuring offer. This is sabotage, Derek had accused. You deliberately undermined a multi-million-dollar partnership because you couldn't handle a routine position adjustment. The accusation was both unfair and revealing. Derek genuinely believed that vendor partnerships were company assets that could be maintained regardless of relationship quality or management approach. He couldn't understand that James Morrison's decision reflected legitimate business concerns about Pinnacle's changing vendor management philosophy. Derek James Morrison is a successful business executive who makes decisions based on strategic considerations, I'd responded. If he's terminating the partnership, it's because he believes Derek's management approach conflicts with Apex Manufacturing's needs for collaborative vendor relationships. The call had ended with Derek threatening legal action for tortious interference with business relationships. I'd consulted with an employment attorney that afternoon, who'd assured me that Derek had no legal basis for such claims. Resigning from a position and explaining the reasons to business contacts didn't constitute interference. It was protected speech about workplace conditions. The fallout at Pinnacle Solutions had been immediate and severe. James Morrison's cancellation had triggered a cascade of operational challenges that Derek hadn't anticipated. Apex Manufacturing had been responsible for nearly 30% of Pinnacle's logistics capacity, and replacing that volume would require months of relationship building with alternative vendors. Ashley had called me Friday evening with updates on the office chaos. Derek spent the entire day on the phone trying to find replacement vendors. He's discovering that other logistics companies are either too expensive or can't match Apex's capacity and reliability. The desperation is palpable. More problematic for Derek was the reaction from Pinnacle's other vendors. Word had spread quickly through the industry about my resignation and the circumstances surrounding Apex's contract cancellation. Several other vendor partners had begun questioning their own relationships with Pinnacle Solutions. Michael in finance says 3 other vendors called this week asking about payment terms and contract stability, Ashley had continued. They're worried that Derek's cost-cutting approach will target them next. The vendor confidence that you spent years building is evaporating. The irony wasn't lost on me. Derek's aggressive cost reduction strategy was actually increasing Pinnacle's expenses as nervous vendors demanded more favorable payment terms and reduced credit extensions. The trust-based relationships I'd cultivated had provided Pinnacle with operational flexibility and preferential treatment that Derek hadn't valued until it disappeared. Monday morning brought the most significant development. I'd received a call from Lisa Chen, Pinnacle's chief executive officer, requesting an immediate meeting. We'd worked together periodically over the years, and she'd always expressed appreciation for my vendor relationship management approach. "Veda, I need to understand exactly what happened last week," Lisa had said when we met for coffee Tuesday morning. "Derek's telling one story, but the numbers are telling another. We've lost our largest vendor partner, 3 other vendors are requesting contract modifications, and our operational capacity is seriously compromised." I'd provided a detailed account of Derek's restructuring demands, his adversarial vendor management philosophy, and the sequence of events leading to my resignation. Lisa had listened carefully, asking clarifying questions about specific vendor relationships and the business impact of Derek's communication approach. The Apex Manufacturing Partnership generated $4.3 million in annual revenue, I'd explained. But beyond the direct financial impact, they provided production capacity that supported another $2 million in client services. Losing them creates operational gaps that will affect multiple client relationships. Lisa's expression had grown increasingly concerned as I'd outlined the broader implications. Derek's cost reduction initiative wasn't just affecting vendor relationships. It was jeopardizing Pinnacle's reputation and operational capabilities across multiple business lines. "What would it take to restore the Apex partnership?" Lisa had asked. The question had been complicated to answer honestly. James Morrison made his decision based on Derek's management approach, not personal animosity toward Pinnacle Solutions. Restoring the partnership would require demonstrating that Pinnacle values collaborative vendor relationships over purely transactional cost reduction tactics. Lisa had been direct about the internal situation at Pinnacle. Derek's promotion to regional operations manager had been part of a broader cost reduction initiative mandated by the company's board of directors. However, the board expected cost savings to be achieved without compromising operational capabilities or strategic partnerships. Derek interpreted cost reduction as license for aggressive vendor renegotiation, Lisa had explained. But the board's directive was to improve efficiency while maintaining business relationships. Losing our largest vendor partner and destabilizing others represents exactly the opposite of what we intended to achieve. The conversation had continued for over an hour, covering everything from vendor relationship management best practices to Derek's communication style and decision-making approach. Lisa had been particularly interested in understanding why I'd chosen resignation over accepting the restructured position. "My grandmother taught me that dignity isn't negotiable," I'd explained. Derek wasn't just reducing my compensation, he was asking me to participate in destroying relationships I'd spent years building. Accepting that role would have made me complicit in practices I consider unethical and strategically destructive. Lisa had nodded thoughtfully. "The board values principled leadership, Veda. Your decision to resign rather than compromise your professional standards reflects exactly the kind of character we want in management positions." By Wednesday afternoon, Lisa had called with an unexpected proposition. Pinnacle Solutions wanted to offer me Derek's position as regional operations manager, with full authority to rebuild vendor relationships and implement relationship-based management approaches. "We're restructuring the department to prioritize strategic partnerships over short-term cost reduction," Lisa had explained. "Derek's approach has proven counterproductive, and we need leadership that understands the value of collaborative vendor relationships." The offer had been tempting, but I'd needed time to consider the implications. Returning to Pinnacle would mean working to repair relationships that Derek had damaged, including the partnership with Apex Manufacturing. It would also mean leading a team that had witnessed the recent organizational upheaval and might be skeptical about management stability. "What happened to Derek?" I'd asked. "He's been reassigned to focus exclusively on internal cost reduction initiatives," Lisa had responded diplomatically. "His aggressive negotiation skills have value in specific contexts, but vendor relationship management isn't one of them. I'd requested a week to consider the offer, using the time to assess whether returning to Pinnacle aligned with my professional goals and ethical standards. The opportunity to rebuild vendor relationships appealed to me, but I wanted to ensure that the company's commitment to collaborative partnerships was genuine rather than reactive. During that week, I'd received calls from several former colleagues expressing excitement about the possibility of my return. More importantly, I'd heard from multiple vendors who confirmed their willingness to rebuild relationships with Pinnacle under different management. James Morrison asked me to tell you that Apex would reconsider their decision if you were involved in vendor management again, Ashley had reported. He specifically said that trust in leadership makes the difference between transactional and strategic partnerships. The decision to accept Pinnacle's offer had been based on several factors. First, the opportunity to rebuild vendor relationships that I'd originally developed appealed to my professional instincts. Second, Lisa's commitment to relationship-based management represented the kind of leadership philosophy I could support. Finally, the chance to demonstrate that collaborative approaches generated better business outcomes than adversarial tactics aligned with my core beliefs about ethical business practices. My first day back at Pinnacle had been both familiar and strange. Same office building, same colleagues, but fundamentally different organizational dynamics. Lisa had introduced me to the team with clear messaging about strategic direction and management philosophy changes. Veda's returning as regional operations manager with full authority to rebuild our vendor partnerships, Lisa had announced during the staff meeting. We're prioritizing long-term relationship building over short-term cost reduction, and everyone should understand that vendor partners are strategic assets that require collaborative management approaches. The team's response had been overwhelmingly positive. Many colleagues had expressed frustration with Derek's adversarial management style and were eager to return to relationship-based vendor management. Ashley had been particularly vocal about her relief. "It's like the company is remembering its values again," she'd said after the meeting. Derek's approach was creating so much tension and uncertainty, everyone knew it was unsustainable. My first priority had been reaching out to James Morrison at Apex Manufacturing. The call had been both professional and personal, acknowledging the damaged relationship while exploring possibilities for rebuilding the partnership. "James, I want to start by apologizing for the unprofessional treatment you received from Pinnacle during my absence," I'd begun. Derek's communication approach didn't reflect the company's values or our historical commitment to collaborative partnerships. James had been cautious but receptive. Veda, our business relationship, was built on trust and mutual respect over 5 years. Derek's approach suggested that Pinnacle had fundamentally changed its vendor management philosophy. If that's not the case, we're willing to discuss rebuilding the partnership. The conversation had lasted 2 hours, covering everything from Derek's ultimatum tactics to Pinnacle's renewed commitment to relationship-based vendor management. James had been particularly interested in understanding what organizational changes would prevent future relapses into adversarial approaches. "Lisa Chen has given me complete authority over vendor relationship management," I'd explained. "Derek's role has been restructured to focus on internal operations rather than vendor partnerships. The board of directors has explicitly endorsed collaborative rather than adversarial vendor management as our strategic approach going forward." By the end of our conversation, James had agreed to a gradual rebuilding process, rather than immediately restoring the full $4.3 million partnership. Apex would begin with smaller projects that would allow both companies to rebuild trust and demonstrate commitment to collaborative relationships. The rebuilding process with Apex Manufacturing had taken 3 months of careful relationship management and consistent demonstration of Pinnacle's renewed commitment to collaborative partnerships. Each successful project had increased James Morrison's confidence in our strategic alignment and operational reliability. The breakthrough had come during a complex logistics challenge involving time-sensitive deliverables for one of Pinnacle's largest clients. Apex had worked collaboratively with our team to develop innovative solutions that exceeded client expectations while maintaining cost efficiency. The successful project had demonstrated exactly why strategic partnerships generated better outcomes than purely transactional relationships. "This is the kind of collaboration that built our original partnership," James had said after the project's completion. "When challenges arise, we work together to find solutions rather than pointing fingers or renegotiating terms. That's the foundation of sustainable business relationships." By month 4 of my return, Apex Manufacturing had fully restored their partnership with Pinnacle Solutions. The $4.3 million annual contract had been renewed with additional provisions for expanded services and collaborative innovation initiatives. More importantly, the relationship had evolved beyond its previous scope to include strategic planning and joint business development opportunities. The success with Apex had created positive momentum with other vendor partners as well. 3 vendors who had been considering alternative logistics companies had renewed their contracts with improved terms that reflected renewed confidence in Pinnacle's management stability. 2 new vendor partnerships had been established with companies that had previously avoided working with Pinnacle due to reputation concerns about management approach. Derek's reaction to the vendor relationship rebuilding had been predictably negative. He'd complained to human resources about preferential treatment and unclear authority structures that prevented him from implementing cost reduction initiatives. Lisa Chen had addressed his concerns directly and definitively. "Derek, vendor relationship management is outside your current role," Lisa had explained during their meeting. "Your focus should be on internal operational efficiency initiatives where aggressive cost reduction approaches are appropriate and effective." The conversation had ended Derek's attempts to undermine the vendor relationship rebuilding process, but his resentment remained obvious. Several colleagues had reported that Derek continued to criticize relationship-based management approaches and predict that collaborative vendor partnerships would prove financially unsustainable. 6 months after my return, the financial results had proven Derek wrong conclusively. Pinnacle's vendor-related expenses had decreased by 12% compared to Derek's management period, despite renewed emphasis on relationship building rather than aggressive cost reduction. The improvement had resulted from vendor loyalty benefits including preferential pricing, extended payment terms, and reduced onboarding costs for new partnerships. More significantly, client satisfaction ratings had improved dramatically as vendor partnership stability had eliminated delivery delays and quality inconsistencies that had plagued Pinnacle during Derek's adversarial management period. 3 major clients had expanded their contracts, specifically citing improved reliability and service quality. The 1-year anniversary of Derek's Ultimatum had provided an opportunity to reflect on the lessons learned from the entire experience. Standing up for principles had involved significant personal and professional risks, but the long-term outcomes had validated the decision to prioritize integrity over job security. Derek's aggressive cost reduction approach had cost Pinnacle Solutions far more than the salary savings achieved through my forced resignation. The $4.3 million Apex Manufacturing partnership, vendor confidence destabilization, client service disruptions, and replacement vendor hire costs had created financial impacts that dwarfed any short-term savings from position restructuring. More importantly, the experience had demonstrated that sustainable business success requires leadership, approaches that value relationships, trust, and collaborative problem-solving over pure cost reduction and adversarial tactics. Vendors, clients, and employees all respond positively to management philosophies that prioritize mutual respect and strategic partnership development. Lisa Chen had been explicit about the lessons learned from Derek's management experiment. "Aggressive cost reduction has its place in business operations," she'd said during our quarterly review. "But vendor relationships are strategic assets that require collaborative management approaches. Derek's tactics might work for negotiating office supplies, but they're destructive when applied to strategic partnerships." The vendor relationship rebuilding success had led to additional opportunities within Pinnacle Solutions. Lisa had asked me to develop relationship management training programs for other departments and share best practices with regional managers at other company locations. The role had evolved beyond vendor management to include strategic partnership development across multiple business lines. James Morrison had become more than a vendor partner. He'd become a case study advocate for relationship-based business practices. During industry conferences, he'd spoken about the contrast between adversarial and collaborative vendor management approaches, using our partnership as an example of how trust-based relationships generate superior business outcomes. When Veda left Pinnacle, we immediately began evaluating alternative logistics providers, James had said during one conference presentation. But her return and the company's renewed commitment to collaborative partnerships convinced us to rebuild the relationship. That decision has led to innovation opportunities and cost efficiencies that purely transactional relationships can't achieve. The personal satisfaction from rebuilding vendor relationships had been enhanced by positive impacts on colleague morale and organizational culture. Ashley and other team members had thrived under relationship-based management approaches, developing stronger vendor partnerships and contributing to improved client satisfaction ratings. "Working with you feels completely different from working with Derek," Ashley had observed. "With Derek, every vendor conversation felt like potential conflict. With your approach, vendor partners feel like team members working toward shared goals." The final vindication had come through Derek's eventual departure from Pinnacle Solutions. His continued resistance to collaborative management approaches and persistent criticism of relationship-based vendor management had ultimately led Lisa Chen to conclude that his management philosophy didn't align with company values. Derek had found a new position with a cost-reduction consulting firm where his aggressive negotiation tactics were considered valuable skills rather than destructive approaches. His departure had eliminated the last source of internal resistance to collaborative vendor management and allowed the team to focus completely on strategic partnership development. This experience taught me that standing up for principles sometimes requires difficult decisions, but integrity ultimately generates better outcomes than compromise. If this story resonated with you, please consider subscribing to support more content about workplace accountability and ethical business practices. We're building a community that believes in treating people with dignity and respect, regardless of professional hierarchies or power dynamics. The vendor relationships I rebuilt generated millions in revenue for Pinnacle Solutions, proving that collaboration creates more value than coercion. Derek's power trip cost him credibility, professional relationships, and ultimately his position, while demonstrating that sustainable success requires leadership approaches based on mutual respect rather than intimidation tactics.